So as Chair of the Faculty of Economics, let me welcome you to this year's Marshall Lectures, and on behalf of the Faculty of Economics, let me extend an especial welcome to Professor Esther Duflo from MIT, who's this year's Marshall Lecturer. About the organization of these lectures, let me say a couple of words. So before Professor Duflo presents the first of her lectures today, I'd like to make a few introductory remarks about her career and her contributions to economics. And the first Marshall lecture itself will be approximately an hour's duration. Tomorrow we'll reconvene again here at 5 o'clock for the second of the Marshall lectures, and then again that will be similarly an hour's duration, and then we'll have a question and answer session for about half an hour where you can put your various comments, etc., to Professor Duflo. So about Professor Duflo then, apart from various visiting positions, she's spent her, it seems to me at least, looking at her CV, her entire academic career at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology since graduation, also from MIT. She's currently Abdul Latif Jameel Professor of Poverty Alleviation and Development Economics there, and Director of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Laboratory. Professor Duflo has won numerous awards and prizes. These include the 2010 John Bates Clark Medal that is now awarded annually for that American economist under the age of 40 who is judged to have made the most significant contribution to economic thought and knowledge. And she's also been awarded a 2009 Marshall Fellowship for talented individuals who have shown extraordinary originality and dedication in their creative pursuits and a marked capacity for self-direction. She's also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a fellow of the Econometric Society. Professor Duflo is probably most popularly known in the wider community for her recent book and bestseller, Poor Economics, authored with Professor Abhijit Banerjee, also of MIT. Briefly, this book surveys, describes the research undertaken by her, Professor Banerjee, and a number of others, which is concerned with trying to understand why many large-scale development projects and policies, whether interventionist or laissez-faire, have had relatively little or unexpected impact on the poorest of developing countries' populations, with a particular emphasis on their often disparate effects on women and children. They present arguments in that book and obviously in their many publications that only really by a detailed examination of the particular context in which economic agents such as families and households are placed and their perceptions of such can these failures of development policies be explained. A kind of very interesting and distinctive feature of their analysis is the use of field experiments, or rather randomized controlled trials, which are well known in the medical literature, to try and uncover the various linkages and causal relationships between policy, poverty, behavior, and socioeconomic status. And indeed, an important outcome of this research is that in certain situations, only mild perturbations are necessary as interventions to actually induce quite large changes in socially and economically desirable changes in behavior. So without further ado, let me introduce Professor Duflo, our Marshall Lecture for 2012-13, present the first of the lectures on paternalism, freedom, hope in the fight against poverty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's a tremendous honor to be here. As a student of economics some time ago now, I heard about this, read some of the lectures of people, never thought that that I would find myself in this position. So I'm still a little shy about the whole thing. But in any case, thank you very much for the kind words as well. It's appropriate to have mentioned poor economics because the two lectures I'm going to give today and tomorrow are really very much based on that book, although they try to start from this book and develop some of the themes a little bit further. Poor economics was written as a topic by topic kind of a book. There's a chapter on education, there is a chapter on health, and there is a chapter on credit markets, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's only at the end, and I must say, to a large extent, through the process of putting the research of many, many people together and in perspective in order to put the book together, that we started seeing some general themes emerging. I would hardly call them lessons, other than they are not policy lessons, but they are general themes that can give some light to every single of the individual topics and subjects that were covered in the book. And these themes we briefly evoke in the conclusion, but it being the nature of a conclusion, we are not going to write a book again. And therefore, they are only evoked relatively briefly as a way of putting together much of this material. So what this gave me the occasion to do is to go back to two of those themes and major lessons and try to go a little bit further into pulling together a strand of evidence and of various thinking and results in the literature to shed more light on each of these. And so these two lessons are, on the one hand, the very specific, delicate, potentially controversial place of paternalism in the fight against poverty. And the second is the notion of possible poverty traps based on hope or lack thereof, and stress and or lack thereof in the life of the poor. So these are the two things I'm going to do for these lectures. Let me start with a caveat. This is supposed to be a quote from John Rawls. That's what Cass Sunstein claims. And I trust Cass Sunstein, so it must be true. He says, we post a signpost, no deep thinking here, things are bad enough already. So what I'm going to talk about is rather, simple and pedestrian in some sense, but I hope it has some practicality and will help also understanding a little bit better how the poor lives. And if it's good enough for John Rawls, it will be good enough for us. So let me start with the definition of paternalism in order to get into the subject in a coherent way. A little bit later in the talk, there will be a definition of freedom as well, so we will be able to see how these two things relate. So paternalism admits many definitions, but the one I'm going to use for the purpose of this talk is it's the provision of basic needs, such as clean water, wholesome foods, a helmet over your head when you drive a motorcycle, often without consulting people on what those basic needs are. And in particular, in the case of a helmet when you are on a motorcycle, without necessarily asking them. There are various forms in which paternalism creeps in. It's all around us, in the air we are breathing, essentially. In the law and regulation, for example, you have to wear a helmet when you wear a motorcycle. In particular, as far as the poor are concerned, it often makes its way as a bundle with some form of redistribution. For example, in a lot of cases, aid to the poorest is given not in the form of cash transfers, but in the form of food vouchers, food stamps in the US, or food subsidies in many developing countries, which of course is a way of trying to steer them in a particular direction for the use of that money that they are having. And sometimes there becomes a little more controversial when an extra layer of paternalism is imposed. For example, when the mayor of New York, who is a well-known paternalist, pragmatic thinker and policymakers, decides that, or tries to decide that the food stamps, which already can only be used to purchase food, should not be used to purchase Coke or other type of soda. So it's adding a layer of paternalism on the existing paternalistic structure. If the poor want the money, they have to take it with the strings that come attached, and therefore you are leading them in a direction where you think they should be going. So as the example that I just gave shows, or as the example of the motorcycle helmet shows, this seems to be go in obvious conflict at a very prima facie level with freedom, in that it takes away the right to choose. So if the food stamps are such that people are not be able to buy soda with it, people who are poor are not going to be able to use their food money to buy soda. Of course, they still have other monies. Money is fungible, so they'll still be able to buy sodas, but that restricts a little bit their freedom. Of course, with a helmet law, that restricts your freedom a whole lot. So the fact that it goes against freedom doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. It might still be desirable to do it. Freedom is not the only thing we care about. There are many reasons why sometimes we think that our society thinks that people should do things that they don't want to do. Of course, there are cases that I'm going to completely ignore in the purpose of this lecture, where we want people to do things they don't want to do because that's good for the rest of us. So this is cases where there are externalities, for example. So we want to make immunization free, or if possible even like subsidize people to get it, because there are benefits not only for the child who is immunized, but for everybody around them. So that's an argument where you're going to force people to do things or induce people to do things because it's good for society's point of view. I'm going to completely abstract from that, in that that's the standard word of public finance 101. You want to do these things even if, because individual rationality doesn't lead to the best social outcome. So that's something we're going to leave out. Even in the absence of externality, for example, in the case of helmet laws, you could think there is very little externalities for people to not wear helmet. Usually if they crash, they die, so they don't even impose any particular cost on society except their loved one, which presumably they are already internalizing, so we have no reason to worry about that, and still there are helmet laws. So you might still want to do that, even though it's against their freedom, because you might think people are ignorant, so they don't know that it's really not good to crash without a helmet, or there are problems with procrastination, conflicting selves. Young people do not think hard enough about what is in their own interest, and we need to take over for them because society or their parents or someone knows better what is good for them. But we realize that it's against their freedom. So there are situations where, even though it's against freedom to be paternalistic, we still consider that it's still a right thing to do. But generally, it's viewed as quite negatively to take freedoms away, to provide them something that they didn't necessarily ask for, usually in situations where they are slightly trapped, because it goes with the aid you have to give them. And so we think development should be about empowering people. It shouldn't be about keeping them in infancy and restricting their choices. And therefore, to the extent that paternalism constrains freedom, it's a bad thing. So what I want to talk about today is try to revisit this notion that paternalism runs necessarily counter to freedom. And the argument I'm going to try to make in the lecture to summarize the argument is that decisions are not made in a vacuum. They are made in a specific environment that has tremendous impacts on the way we act and the way we behave. In other words, the environment is making a lot of decisions for us. And we have to take that as given when we're thinking about making policy. We cannot just ignore the fact that we are not we are not making decision in the abstract. We're making decision in an environment that's already very much steering us in a particular direction. And it turns out, so this is something that Cass Sunstein refers to as the choice architecture. The second point is that that environment turns out to be very, very different in rich countries and in poor countries, and even within countries tend to be very different for the poor and for the rich. And in particular, I'm going to try to argue that the richer you are, either by virtue of changing countries or even within a country, the more the right, quote-unquote, decisions are being made for you. That is, the richer you are, the more the default situation in the environment, if you yourself make no decision and go with the flow, is steering you in a set of situations where your basic needs will be taken into account. And the poorer you are, the more, if you make no choices, you're going to end up in the wrong place from the point of view of getting those basic needs. That is, basic health, food, correct shelter, etc. So given that, the question that I want to ask is whether that presumably didn't come out of that didn't come by chance. That came out of a series of choices that were taken by societies democratically, or that are being taken by rich people in a more private way. And maybe, therefore, there is some revealed preference that it's something that people find desirable, and maybe they find it desirable because it's freedom enhancing. So that leads us to ask the question of why would it be the case? Is there a way in which having some basic decisions taken away from you can improve your freedom in a meaningful way? So that will imply defining freedom appropriately to answer that question, because I'm going to ask whether I'm taking some choices away from you, does that make you more free or not? So for that, we are going to have to define freedom as a differently than counting the number of choices you have. If that's the case, then we can ask whether that will imply whether paternalism could, in principle, enhance freedom rather than constrain it. And then I'll finish with some caveats, which are pretty important from a practical point of view about what I'm going to try and say. So let's take a detour and think a bit about paternalism. So paternalism doesn't have good press. It's not a word that we kind of like. And when you treat someone else's policy proposal as paternalistic, generally that's not a good word to apply, except if you're maybe with the possible exception of adding the modifier libertarian, in which case Thaler and Sunstein would go with you. So why don't we like paternalism? Well, it doesn't have a very nice origin. So in its sort of most accomplished form, paternalism originated in France in the company town of 19th century France, actually with a big contrast to what was the situation in industrial town in the UK at the same time, which were not paternalistic at all. So in France, what people do, the Schneider, Japy, Meunier, some of them are Protestant or with Protestant background. Most of them very Christians. They established this company town where they around like one single factory or a set of factories, where they started to provide. So, for example, Schneider was Le Creusot, very well known setting, where they started to provide everything from cradle to grave to their employee, including housing, schools, daycare for the children, retirement fund, health insurance, etc. I mentioned that a lot of these were very Christian. There was a very strong religious ideology behind this system, with very much the view of the patron, the boss, being like a father to the employees that were like children, who had no idea what they needed, who were really like minor and needed to be provided the right thing. As Marxists pointed out, even at the time, they also had an economic and social interest in pushing this. They were very interested in in trying to curtail the self-organizations of workers in worker cooperatives and things like that. And in particular, they were very keen that the workers would not be involved in the management of any of these funds. Where eventually it came to a head, actually, in Le Creusot, for example, is when there were huge strikes on the very issue of whether the workers would be allowed to have one representative on the council that was administering the pension fund that were contributed with their own money. So they were very not keen at all that workers should organize themselves, because they were not keen at all that, because this organization could lead into more revendication and being once you organize to manage your money, you could start making demands and things like that. They were also not keen at all that the government should be involved in creating a retirement system that would be more common to a set of firms as opposed to be just one firm. Partly because they were very keen that workers should be attached to the firm they were involved with. In particular, they were not vested, the workers. So you would contribute to the retirement fund, but should you move elsewhere, then the retirement fund would be gone. So that really, in very many direct ways, led to a very clear restrictions of freedom in an explicit way, not that we're not particularly shy about it, and offered a clear trade-off between freedom and comfort, which was rooted in a view of the poor that is openly demeaning. And that's where paternalism comes from, and we have to take that into account. Another thing that sort of happened more or less at the same time, and that is relevant to our to thinking about development today, is that it is at the same time that the colonial expansion took place. And it proceeded with its own version of paternalism with the same mixed motive, with the white man's burden idea, where the colonized are both to be saved of their own, heathen ways and exploited for economic reasons. Western culture would be imposed as the meaning of civilization. And so we have the same kind of slight discomfort in both at home and in developing countries, imposing the view of a few, possibly with some self-serving motive in the back of our minds. So today, the critique of aid points towards this origin as the same, and point to the same dual motives when they criticize aid. There is a supposed superiority of the aid worker today who claims to know better than the poor, coupled with the economic interest, more or less explicit. Could be the perpetuation of the aid lobby per se, or the commercial interest of the Western countries, or what have you. And this extends not only to aid worker, but generally to more general criticism of government intervention. And in fact, for a lot of people who are very attached to freedom, in particular free markets, the fact that developing countries today are small, the government of developing countries are small because the tax revenues, tax collection system is not in place, and the government is small relative to the economy, and the economy is small. So that makes it very small. That's actually a window of opportunity to not repeat what has been done in the rich country with the expansion of social protection and transform these poor countries, which are now, in a sense, free of governments, into the nanny states we have. Oops. So there are empowerment movements, so in particular microfinance organizations, people who insist about the community or proponent of decentralizations, have this like anti-aid, anti-government, anti-charity notion that all go together with the notion that to these things you oppose freedom and free spirit and free enterprises. So in principle, this doesn't mean less help for the poor, but it means a very different type of help than that is being traditionally provided, if you will, by a government. So instead of providing public schools, you would provide private school vouchers so people can make their own decisions. Instead of giving subsidies to firms to establish factories here and there. You will subsidize interest rate for microfinance organizations. In principle, it is often stretched to make the argument that the best public policy is no public policy, or at least very little public policies, create the opportunity and get out of the way. Here is one example from Mohamed Yunus, who is very much on the empowerment, no paternalism direction. When we want to help the poor, we usually offer them charity. Most often we use charity to avoid recognizing the problem and finding a solution for it. Charity becomes a way to shrug off our responsibility. But charity is no solution to poverty. It only perpetuates poverty by taking the initiative away from the poor. Charity allows us to go ahead with our own life without worrying about the lives of the poor. Charity appeases our conscience. So what I want to attract your attention to here is this idea of charity only perpetuates poverty by taking the initiative away from the poor, which again goes in this direction of paternalism is against freedom. So now that we have done this detour and say why this is, I think it's important to sort of clarify in the back of our mind why we have these like negative things in mind. Let's think a bit about in which environment all this is all taking place. So Sunstein and Taylor have at least popularized, there is a lot of research that they were involved with and others were involved with, the importance of default options in shaping our decisions. So it's default option or choice architectures. So the default is the option that is going to be chosen if an individual exercises no choice at all. So, for example, a first very clear demonstration of this is on 401k, like retirement plans in a firm. You could either be in by default or out by default. So if you're in by default, you can get out by saying, I don't want to be part of the retirement plan. If you're out by default, you can come in by saying, I want to join the retirement plan. So it turns out this has a huge impact on whether people are in the retirement plan or out of the retirement plan. Likewise, the mix of assets that people were initially put in, say all safe or 50-50 bonds, 50-50 stocks, that has a huge influence on what people end up having in terms of the allocation of their assets. So in a lot of cases, people just do not switch to whatever option was provided by default, either because they think that there is some information in the default, you know why they don't know any better, if the firm has decided, if their employer in its infinite wisdom has decided that 50 bonds, 50 stock was the right thing, they must know better. Or because they procrastinate, they just don't want to think about it and they leave it the way it is. Or because they are intimidated by having to choose or what have you. For all of these reasons, default have an enormous influence on the final choices, even when it's very easy to override them, even when it's almost free to override them. It just takes a little bit of time. Defaults are influenced by social structure, by regulation, by trust, by social norms. All of that sets default. For example, if it is when you open the water, at least in the US, there is both chlorine and fluoride. I don't know if there is fluoride in the UK. So that means that by default, we have fluoride in water. It also happens to be a bit hard to get rid of it, but you could get bottled water, and then you would have no fluoride in the bottled water. So by default, you have fluoride in your water. That's good for your teeth. Maybe it makes you stupid if you have too much of it, but you would really need to have a lot of it. So that's one example. Regulations, of course, create defaults by setting up what people are supposed to be doing. Trusts create defaults by helping us determine whether or not we should do one thing or the other. We look around us, what other people are saying. We trust or we don't trust what people are telling us. For example, in rich countries, we tend to trust what our doctors tell us. So or we tend to trust the results of tests, medical tests once we get them. So once we get the medical tests, unless we really don't like the answer, we just know the results and we take some decision as a basis of that. In poor countries, people don't necessarily trust the results of medical tests because some of the medical tests are counterfeits or they are simply have a lot of errors and they know that. And therefore, the default is very different. If the default when you take a test is that you don't trust the results, you're going to behave very differently. So for example, Pascaline Dupas, Simone Shannon, Jessica Cohen have this paper where they show that when people test negative for malaria, they still will buy the malaria medicine and take it, just in case, in fact, they have malaria. So that creates a very different default where here, if you test negative for malaria, that could happen if you have fever after having gone to Kenya, but you test negative, you won't take the malaria medicine, you do something else. So that sets a very different default situation. Social norms also set a default. It tells us, what other people are doing is probably, good enough for what I should be doing. So for example, Kaivan Munshi has this nice paper on contraception in Bangladesh. When contraception was first introduced in a region, in an experimental region in MATLAB, people at first, nobody was taking contraception, so it took some time for people to establish that it was the okay thing to do, to take contraception, not be punished for that, so contraception becomes the default as opposed to the default being no contraception. So all of these situations are vastly different for the poor and for the rich. So let's take the example one by one. So public infrastructure, we discussed water. So here, if you open the water by default, there is chlorine and fluoride. It's clean. It's good for you. For the vast majority of the world's poor, the water by default is not good for you. It doesn't have fluoride in it, but it also has a lot of other things you might not like to have in your drink of water. So it should be boiled. You can make it clean, but you need to boil it or you need to put chlorine in it. So you can get away from the default of having bad water, but it will take some effort. Rules are different. So for example, in rich countries, there is mandatory vaccination. As we discussed before, it could be for externality reasons as opposed to helping your own child. But it is also end up being the default, so everybody gets immunized. In developing countries, it is usually not mandatory to be immunized. Even if it were, it wouldn't make any sense in a setting where the government are not in a position to actually immunize everybody. So if you make immunization compulsory in India tomorrow, that wouldn't make any sort of sense because there is no way for the government to implement that order. Administrative barriers are vastly different for the poor and for the rich, both because the administration is more competent in rich countries, so things are easier to do, and because the same administrative barrier would be harder to overcome for someone who is less literate, doesn't necessarily speak the right language, doesn't live in the city, etc. So for example, in Morocco, we did a study on, which was meant initially to be, in our head, to be a study of access to clean water, which in a sense is access to clean water. It's not so much access to clean water, it's access to clean water from a tap, because the people had access to clean water already anyway from the public service. But now the company was interested in getting people access to water at home, and what they had is a program, what they wanted to introduce is a program where people would get free credit to do the necessary work in order to have water at home. And we were interested in doing a randomized evaluation of that program. So what we proposed the company is, fine, make it available to everyone. But what we are going to do is to randomly select half the people in very small areas, so close together. We're going to see some people, and we're going to offer them to do all the steps, all the small administrative steps you need to get the connection and the credit at home if they are interested. So they won't need to go to the city hall and do it. They said, sure, you do that. And we're a little worried that we will not have a very strong first stage, that is, there won't be a very big differences between one neighbor whom we have visited and done the administrative for them at home, and one neighbor who will have to go alone to the municipal office and done it. And in fact, there was a huge difference. There was a difference between 85% of people signed up for the program when we went to their home, And something like 20% signed up to the program when we didn't go to their home. And even though they found out about it, but they just didn't make the steps. They didn't do the things because it was a bit complicated. Not very complicated, but enough complicated that it was a barrier. And interestingly, the people who did it, even though they now had to pay a higher price for the water because it came to their home, and they had to reimburse the credit and all of that, they were much, much, much happier at the end of it because they were so happy to have water at home. So this small little barrier of going to the post office creates like massive loss of welfare. The poor are also less likely to know what services are available to them than the less poor. The information is less good. They are also less likely to be able to cope with more complex choices because they don't necessarily understand all of the things that they have to understand whether or not to get a product, and they don't necessarily trust the person that prevents them that proposes them these results. So on the complexity of choices, imagine, for example, having to choose a health insurance program when you're offered one. So in these countries and a lot of civilized countries, there is a default option for health insurance, and so you're in it. In India, you can get health insurance, but you will have to figure out someone to provide it to you. You'll have to figure out what you're looking for. You will have to choose the size of the deductible and how many people of your family is to insure and what's the maximal amount that is covered, etc., etc. The amount of choices you'll have to make can be so bewildering that people are just not interested in getting into it. And I already discussed the trust, which is the trust in the view that roughly doctors know what they are doing, roughly we can believe in labels on packages and things like that is a very different, is present here and is not there in the poor countries. And all of that creates massively different default options. There are a few common threads toward in all of these examples. One is that the default that the rich benefit from, that we benefit from in rich countries, and that it's also true of richer people within poor countries, are much more likely to lead to outcomes that where you've achieved life's basic comfort, so like health, like being alive, like having enough money in very bad circumstances, so being insured against very bad situations. So, for example, we have access to clean water when most poor people don't have access to clean water. So they can get clean water by boiling their water, but that's not the default. And all the series of choices, not all of them, but all the examples I gave before, and most of the examples we can think about, the defaults are organized such that, by and large, if we do nothing, we end up in the right place. That's the first thing. Secondly, although that's not so important for the argument, but that's worse, I think that is, by and large, correct, is the default of the rich are actually more constraining. They take more freedom away. So take the example of water. You can get dirty water if you want to, but you'd have to go camping. You can be off the grid if you want to, but you'd have to create your own toilets or things like that. You can remove the fluoride, but you'd have to pay for the water. Some people might do that because they think fluoride is bad. So they will go and buy mineral water. So that's possible, but that's a little bit complicated. Whereas when you're poor and you have access to dirty water, you can clean it. You can boil it, or you can put chlorine in it, and it's very cheap. So in that sense, the rich people are more constrained in their choices than the poor are. Of course, that's not necessarily true for all of the examples that I mentioned, but it's true for a lot of them. It's very difficult to opt out of health insurance in this country, and soon even in the US, it's going to be impossible to opt out of health insurance. For the reason here is not paternalistic, it's social, there is externalities of people not having insurance, but at the end of the day, the description is still that it's easier to get health insurance in India than it is to opt out in the UK. So then we could say, well, the rich certainly have a better life in many ways because they are rich and perhaps because of all those defaults as well. But maybe they are less free. So that's the question that I want to ask, whether it's the case that we have somehow given up our freedom in exchange for those material comfort, maybe knowingly, maybe not, maybe we got fooled into this. Or maybe it is a way of being less free. So for that, we need to define freedom in order to understand. So some people literally define freedom as the number of, some philosophers define freedom as the number of choices you have. I don't find it that very, very helpful, because unless we sort of value the choices, anything could be defined as a choice. And Martisan was discussing this one day, and he said, well, in the US, you can choose between any number of bags of tea, but the water is always lukewarm. So you can never, you have a lot of choices, but you cannot get a proper cup of tea. So following Sen, we are going to define freedom as freedom to achieve substantial freedom. So that's substantial freedom. It's the capacity to realize your potential as a human being. So the example one of the first examples that he gave to help us think about that is the famine in West Bengal. The famine in Bengal, actually, was all of Bengal at the time, during the war. Prices went up a lot. People were, in a sense, still free to buy rice if they had the money, but they were unable to do it. So it would make no sense to say that these people were free when they were dying of starvation. Likewise, it would make no sense to say that people in Haiti became more free. They didn't have cholera, so they had no option of getting cholera before. Now they do. If they don't boil their water, that doesn't make them more free. So we realize the limit of that definition of having more choices when we look at this extreme example. So the notion of freedom as freedom to achieve is closely linked to another of Sen's notion of capability. Capabilities are some version of human capital in a way. They are the things that help us achieve, the things that make us able, I like to think of this as the things that make us able to think about other important things in life. So in order to think about, our political choices, about, how the poor live, or about poetry or things like that, I need to have enough to eat. I need to be able to read and write. I need to have some basic health, not worrying about my health all the time or that of my children. I need the capacity to achieve nutritional status if I want to, or the capacity to starve if I wish to fast. But I need that option. So these are what Sen's called capabilities. So the reason why these two are linked is in order to be free, you need to have those basic capabilities. Otherwise, you're not very free because you're just like keeping swimming upstream in order to have those capabilities at your disposal that make you able to think and to disagree about things that people really disagree about. So an agent is, again, following Sen, an agent is someone who is able to act according to his or her own values and objectives. And the power of default that we just saw and the power of inertia constrain agencies because it always orients you in a particular direction. So it forces it. So when you don't really act according to your own value because the default is pushing you in some direction. But now you compare the status quo for the rich and for the poor. All of the status quo for the rich bring them towards basic capabilities. They, by and large, makes them more healthy, protect them, offer them a modicum of protection in case of a very bad outcome, etc. So a status quo that steers you in the direction of this of basic capability, I would argue, leads to more freedom, even if it's more constraining. So even if it's a law and something you cannot override, or even something that is difficult to constraining, I would contend a status quo that steers you in the direction of basic capabilities, leads you to more freedom for two reasons. One is because this particular default makes it less likely that you miss out on one of these basic capabilities without which you cannot realize your freedom. So, for example, if you don't boil your water and you're sick with cholera and you die, once you die, you're not free. Or even if you're just very sick with cholera, your children are very sick with cholera and you have to deal with that, you're not free. Your capabilities are constrained, or your children's capabilities are constrained. So that's the first reason. So the poor are more likely to make the mistakes that steer them away from having the basic. Think of it as the platform we stand on, the basic platform we stand on to realize our own freedom. So that's the first more obvious channel. The second channel, which is maybe less obvious, but at least as important, is that few people disagree. There is almost no disagreement that to be free, you need to be alive, and you have to have eaten enough, and you're not sick. Maybe education, there is a bit more reading and writing. Maybe there is a bit more disagreement, but probably not that much either. So a lot of people, so these are decisions that are not very interesting and not very important. So people have to make them all the time, but they are not interesting. There is no disagreement on them. But we don't have an infinite amount of time, and we don't have an infinite amount of mental energy. So if you have spent all of your time in the day dealing with taking all of these extremely boring decisions on which everybody agrees anyway, then you have less time and less energy to take the decision on which there could be a disagreement, to take the decision on which you could go into very various directions. So the basic capability that the poor achieve might be the same at the end. I don't think they are, actually. I think the poor do make mistakes as a result of not being protected against themselves. But let's say they arrive at the same point. Even if they arrive at the same point, they're still less free because they have wasted so much time getting there. When we get up, we stumble out of bed and it's done. So the issue is, so freedom then for the poor becomes in some sense the freedom to lose, the freedom to stumble. So take the example of water. As we mentioned, it is very easy for the poor to get away from the default of having dirty water. The reason why it's very easy is that you don't even need to boil the water, which might be a bit complicated, since you would need to find fuel, and once you boil the water in your house, there'll be indoor air pollution, and you'll be sick with pollution. But all of that would be harder. But in a lot of places, in most places, what's available is chlorine drop that you put in the water. They're not very tasty, but they're there. They're not very expensive. And yet many people do not use them. Purchase is very sensitive to prices. So a lot of people don't end up getting clean water. Why it's the case? There is some procrastination, there is some lack of information, maybe not full understanding of the connection between chlorine and clean water and diseases. So Michael Kramer and many others are working on this project, which is to making chlorine available to people next to the source in the dispenser that they can just click. One click, so they take the water from the well, it's dirty, then immediately next to it, they put it next to the dispenser, one click, and they get the dose of chlorine that is needed for that amount of water. So that, when it's been sustained consistently next to a source, leads to a huge increase in the fraction of people who have residual chlorine in their water once it's tested. And then there are other studies showing that it is actually, having chlorine in your water protects you against cholera and other childhood diarrhea, etc. So that becomes an extremely cheap way to protect people from dirty water. So here what you are doing with this is to try to orient people away from the possibility to forget to add chlorine, even if they still can forget to add chlorine, but they're less likely to forget if it's right here and they don't have to go to the shop and they don't have to pay and they don't have to do anything. So this has a big impact directly on the number of people who have chlorine in their water, and it has potentially an indirect impact, which is it makes this choice, it doesn't take away the choice to people because there is no way to take the choice away to people in this case, because it would be too expensive to pipe everybody and put water in the system. But it makes it very easy. So why would you make choice very easy? Why is there potentially a value in making choice very easy? Choosing is not costless. So Rada Iyengar has a lot of work on that. It takes time to consider the option. It takes effort. It takes energy. It stresses people out. People do not like to have too many choices. For example, if you ask people, Rada Iyengar asks people to choose. Actually, it's not, Rada is not her first name. So I apologize. Dr. Iyengar, whose first name escapes me, asks people to choose between different types of jams in a supermarket. And people are much happier when you ask them to choose between two types of jams than when you give them a whole array of jams to buy for. They report being much happier. They're also much more likely to buy one of the jams that they have actually tested. So people do not like to have too many choices to make. So the process is not pleasant. Secondly, if there are many choices, including one that would lead to immediate reward at the cost of some loss in welfare in the future, then it takes self-control to take the patient choice. So you can still do it, but you have exercised a little bit of your self-control. So if you're one of these parents who in the morning go to the shop and instead of buying cigarettes, buy a little bottle of chlorine for about the same price, you've exercised a self-control. You exercise your self-control to get this choice. On two margin, you won't poison yourself with a cigarette and you'll get the chlorine. And it turns out we do have limited amount of the resources that are needed to make of self-control. We do have limited amount of the resources that are needed to make these choices. We have a limited amount of time, as you might know. We have a limited amount of cognitive resources, as I know. You have limited amount of self-control. This has been shown in experiments after the other in psychology. For example, if you ask people to do some task while not thinking about a wild bear, this is hard for them. And they are less good at the task than if you just ask them to do a task. In fact, this white bear experiment is used as a way to deplete people's self-control before giving them some other task. So if for your experiment you need to deplete experimentally some people's self-control, you first give them the task for a few minutes to think about everything except a white bear, and then you do that for a few minutes, then they are ready to do whatever other task you're interested with less self-control than the control group that didn't have the white bear to think about. Elgar Shafir and Sandil Mullainathan have shown in experiments that there is contagion between these different domains. So if people have been stressed out or have needed to make a decision where there is a trade-off between today and tomorrow, there is a difficult financial decision they have to make, and you then ask them to solve some mazes or do another IQ test, they are doing less well on the IQ. So their experiment is the following. They're going to a mall, and they're asking people some notion about their income, and then they're asking people to think about a situation where they have to fix their car. And in some cases, so you have poor people and richer people, and the tasks about fixing your car can be a small problem or a large problem that's going to cost more money. So they ask people to think about how they're going to cope with the car fixing problem, going to the garages, finding the money, etc. And the poor people who have to fix a hard car problem in their head do less well on mazes and IQ tests that they do later than the poor people who have had to in their mind, think about an easy care problem. And that difference is not there for the rich. So there is like a contagion between all of these things. So if you spend a lot of time thinking about things that stress you out, you're going to be less good at doing math problems. So when we waste time and our resources on things that we largely agree we want, like a functioning car in this case, or like clean water, we don't have these resources available to spend on thinking about things that are more important in other spheres of our life where there is genuine disagreement. And this can lead to a poverty trap. Sendil Mulayathan and Abhijit Banerjee have a nice model, very simple model that's in the AE Papers and Proceedings in 2008. Which make the point very nicely, very simply. And let me try to describe that model for you. So a person must devote her attention between home life and work life. So let's say she has a small business and she also runs a family. If she does not devote enough attention in her business, there might be some problems that occur in the business that she might not be able to catch on early, and that will lead to a loss of income. And the problems at home lead to a loss of welfare. It makes you unhappy. And they can be mitigated by spending money. So for example, you can get piped water, and then you won't have children sick with diarrhea. And then the main difference between people is that they differ in their productivity at work. To think of their human capital being different, their ability being different. So that's the model, very simple model. So here is where the poverty trap comes from. So when people have more human capital, they make more money. So because they make more money, they can purchase more comfort goods, and they don't need to worry so much about what's happening home. Therefore, they can become more productive at home, at work, and that becomes a virtuous circle. So, and conversely, if someone doesn't have much human capital, they don't make much money, they can't get the good that makes them, that prevents the worry. Therefore, they keep worrying about what's happening in their home, and therefore they're less good at work, and therefore their income is lower. So what is very interesting here is that there is a threshold beyond which people can spend all of their attention at work, and at that threshold there is a jump in income. So even though there is no non-convexity anywhere here, there's no non-convexity in the production function, that creates a poverty trap based on this mechanism of this reinforcement of not having to worry at home and then being able to worry at work. So you can think of it, this to me, I see this as a sort of a good analogy for, it could be your own business, but it can be, the education of your children or the career that you want to pursue, what you are interested in, etc. Do you have any energy to devote to this problem, or are you completely focused on the here and now? So how does that link to paternalism? In the following way. First, poverty traps are less likely to occur if there are fewer problems at home, or if the problems requires less attention, or if the welfare loss they cause is lower. So if there is a publicly provided set of comfort goods, or if there is a default that steers everybody in the direction of not having those problems, it makes it more likely that if that's not available, it makes it more likely that there is a poverty trap. And on the contrary, if those are provided, it makes people free. And what's interesting here is that defaults or mandate here cannot be provided cannot be replaced by so people who recognize the limits of human being, but would still like people to be free and don't like paternalism, like David Lipson, for example, say what we should have is not default. We should force people to make choices. So we should try to be in a situation where nobody is defaulted into a bad situation, but we don't default them into the good situation either. We tell them you have to choose. For example, in a firm when you join, you have to choose whether or not you want to be in the retirement plan or not. So that's his view as often as possible, this is what you need to do. So this will preserve people's freedom. On the other hand, if they put some effort in the choices, they'll make the right choice, they'll be free, and they'll have the right choice, and everybody is home, happy. So that can be a solution, but here it's not going to solve the problem here. Because here the problem is not that people make the wrong choices so much. They might end up all making the right choices at home. It's just they spend too much time making the choices, and they don't have time to take care of other things. So all that implies that some paternalism may be desirable, that the emphasis on self-reliance that is very much behind the Yunus quote that I started with can go too far, that creating the conditions where the basic constituent of healthy and happy life that we kind of all pretty much agree about can be automatized, either through regulation or through the way that redistribution takes place or whatever, can give freedom rather than taking it away. So in the case of the French industrial home, paternalism was meant to trade, to be against in exchange of your freedom. It was structured in order to be tied to an employer and to prevent people to move, etc. Because they were very careful to be sure that the space that could be left for thinking was not used to think about revolution. And they failed, actually. What is very interesting is that despite that, they failed. And maybe they failed because people were not like so crushed under the burden of daily life. It's not a proof, but it's a possibility. Because so here what we are advocating is very much the opposite of what they were doing. The objective is to create a space where choice can be exerted on issues on which choice is meaningful. What do you think about politics? What do you think about your career, your vocation, God, what have you? Most of the choices we make are noise. We don't care. They are just a waste of time. Obama has an interesting quote where he says that he always wears the same suit, blue suit, with the same tie, because he doesn't want to have to choose what he is dressed with in the morning, because he has too many other important choices to make. So that's kind of the same. A lot of the choices we have, they are not meaningful. They need to go away to leave space. Of course, a lot of people would want to have the choice about what they want to wear. So I'm not proposing that paternalism should be everybody gets back into uniform. But at least we should have the choice on whether we want to choose what we want to wear, I guess. So this goes against a culture which is very dominant in the age today, which is the culture of mandated empowerment, which the idea is that you counter paternalism by requiring or by making, at least enabling beneficiary participation. What we've shown, what's in some work we have, is that sometimes the participation is quite perfunctory. For example, in a survey we did about village school committee, a significant fraction of people who are members of the school committee had no idea that they were members of the school committee. So the participation becomes a little bit not very meaningful. And maybe it's because meaningful participation would actually be easier if people had a little bit more time to devote to these issues. And in fact, in the US anyway, people probably devote too much time being involved in the schooling of their children for the good of their children. But like, they have lots of time, so they don't have to worry about the clean water for their children. So that's one notion in which maybe if you want to make people free, the way you do that is not by forcing them to establish school committee where they are not going to go, is by making sure they have a bit of time so that they have enough scope to have the mental resources to be involved in the schools of their children, and then they will be, almost surely. The second way in which I think the mandated empowerment is wrong is that people would actually need help in more life. Poor people would particularly need some help in their home life because their jobs leave very little scope for error. Another thing that is different between the poor and the rich is that the poor are more likely to be in these jobs where making a mistake is very costly because they are entrepreneurs or they are farmers, and therefore they are bearing all the residual risk of their activities. And the richer you are, the more likely you have to be in a job with a salary where you can make a mistake and it's not the end of the world, at least for you. Continuing in this direction, the mistrust of the government as a purveyor of the public goods usually goes hand in hand with a promotion, almost mystical promotion of entrepreneurship for the poor. As in Yunus' views, for example, that the poor need to take care of their own thing because they need to do their own business, etc. And the underlying view of the poor is that the poor are entrepreneurial in their home life because they are being good as being entrepreneurs. So you hear Yunus, and he's giving this wonderful description about how this woman in Bangladesh with 8 children is managing to, take care of them because she is so resourceful, which is surely true. And therefore, she should be a good entrepreneur, which is surely false. It would be true in a model where people differ by their entrepreneurial ability, and you can detect it in their home life, and people who are good in their home life, entrepreneurs in their home life who are good entrepreneurs in general. But it's not true in a world where people need to be entrepreneurial in their home life because nothing is taken care of. Then we are in the world of the Banerjee-Mullainathan model, where the more entrepreneurial you are in your home life, the worse entrepreneur you will be in your career. And in fact, what we see in the work, for example, of David Mackenzie and Chris Woodruff, is that the productivity of women's businesses tend to be much lower than the productivity of male businesses. And they don't have an explanation for that, but that's not accounted by their sector, that's not accounted by a variety of things. One possibility is that the women are so busy trying to keep the home together that there is just no scope left to run a business efficiently. And in that case, it really gives you a different prescription. You either want to have people who have jobs which are easy to do, as opposed to running a business, or to have home life, which is easier to do, which would take a bit of paternalism. I'm running out of time, so I'll just cite down these 3 concerns and run to them. Run to the first 2 very quickly and let the third one hanging. The 3 concerns that you have if you have been with me until now, in terms of practical implication of all of this, is that suppose you cannot be a libertarian paternalist. So that is, you cannot just give people the right default and let them move away from it. Do you still go in the direction of paternalism? Are you still willing, or am I still willing, to impose some things on people? Secondly, who decides what belongs to the basic package that is part of paternalism? Like, is there a chicken and egg problem here? And third is, can we trust developing country governments to be the stewards of this benevolent paternalism? Or even if you agree in principle, do you stumble on the fact that the political system is just not there? So the first point, so the real beauty of the Sunstein-Taylor approach is that you take nothing away, because you need to set a default anyway. You might as well set the right way, and people then still continue to give their freedom, because if they don't like it, they just override the default you put them in. But sometimes it's not practical. So for example, once you put fluoride in water, it's hard to take away, or it's costly to take away. Possible, but costly. If you put iodine in salt, people do need salt. They're not going to be able to get away from the iodine. So then, I mean, unless they get rock salt, but that's going to be very difficult. So sometimes it's not practical. In some sense, always it's not practical, because always there is a bit of a cost of going away from the default. So the libertarian paternalism is a slight, it's not always as pure as what is described in their book. Sometimes you'll have to make decisions. Does paternalism destroy freedom when you overweigh people, carefully weigh decisions, for example, wearing a helmet? So we lose the philosophical comfort of libertarian paternalism. The beauty of their idea is you can have your cake and eat it too, as you make people free and you're living their choices. But my view is that the argument that we just went through is that sometimes the answer would be yes, which is even if it means that you're going to impose something on the vast majority of people are going to agree, and some people are not going to agree, then tough luck. I would still argue that in some cases this is the direction you need to go to. And that's still going to make people more free. The second question is who decides what goes in the basic package? So in the democratic version of paternalism, who is the person who knows better, who decides what to include? So there is a lot of debate on that. So witness the debate in the US about Obamacare. Should there be a health insurance for everybody? Is it okay for the government to mandate people to get health insurance? Is it even constitutional? So the question here is whether there is a chicken and egg issue. Who is going to decide what goes in the basic package? I'm telling you that everybody agrees, but maybe that's not that true, and who decides? So that's a real issue, and one that should be taken seriously, but I don't think it's one that should prevent us from getting started. But there are a number of things on which I don't think there are that many disagreements, really widely shared. For example, things to prevent infants from dying before the age of 1. And there are a number of solutions, maybe not enough as we wish, but a number of solutions that are generally agreed to be working, like putting chlorine in the water. Seems to be like a pretty good way to prevent kids from dying of diarrhea. So these can be in the basic package, and then the package can expand slowly as we discover more things. So there is no reason to wait till we know everything, and we'll never know everything, so there's really not a reason. And the third concern I'm just going to put there, can we trust the governments? Can they be trusted to deliver those goods? Or if there is more things that the government needs to do, will they divert these resources for patronage? That's not the topic of this lecture, so I'm not going to spend any time on it, especially since it's 6:15. But Abhijit Banerjee and I defend a more benign view of governments where there is corruption, sure, but a lot of the problem has little to do with corruption, a lot to do with incompetence, and incompetence can be fixed a little bit easier, and therefore can be discussed. I'll add just one thing to finish, is that remember that part of the problem of the poor is that they spend too much time dealing with very boring problems. Therefore, they don't have time to be very interested in politics and to spend a lot of time monitoring the people who are supposed to serve them. I don't think it's crazy to think that if those basic needs were taken into account, then you would have more concerned, more demanding, and therefore more effective citizens to monitor their politicians, and therefore give those politicians incentive to better behave. So potentially that could sort of be the solution to the very problem that's on the slide. Thank you very much.